The millionaire decided to test the new gardener by leaving the safe open and turning on the camera. But when he reviewed the footage, he couldn't believe what he saw. Before starting the video, tell me where you are watching this video and what time it is. Victor Marquez was a man who embodied discipline and precision. A widower in his late 60s, he had built his empire from the ground up, starting with a modest import-export business that eventually grew into a multi-million-dollar conglomerate. His sprawling estate was a testament to his success. A mansion perched on the hills, overlooking the city, surrounded by acres of meticulously landscaped gardens. Yet, beneath the wealth and grandeur, Victor was a man marked by loneliness and mistrust. Having lost his wife decades ago to a sudden illness, he had no children to carry on his legacy. His days were filled with work, schedules, and a rigid routine that kept his mind sharp and his emotions at bay. Despite his affluence, he trusted few people. Every aspect of Victor's life, from his business dealings to the maintenance of his estate, was governed by strict protocols. His staff, though few, were carefully vetted, and he expected absolute loyalty. Among them was Miguel, the gardener who had worked for him for over 30 years. The gardens, lush, diverse, and perfectly maintained, were Miguel's pride and Victor's daily solace. Victor's skepticism stemmed from bitter experience. Over the years, he had been betrayed by those he thought he could trust. It hardened him, leaving little room for leniency or second chances. While he valued his privacy and independence, the thought of someone crossing him or exploiting his trust kept him on high alert. His life was a fortress of control, but that control would soon be tested in ways he never anticipated. It was an unusually quiet afternoon when Miguel knocked on Victor's study door. The older man entered hesitantly, a folder in hand. Victor, seated behind a massive oak desk, looked up from his paperwork. Miguel's face bore a mixture of reluctance and resolve, a look Victor had rarely seen. "Señor Marquez," Miguel began, his voice tinged with emotion, "I need to speak with you." Victor leaned back, signaling for Miguel to continue. "I've been here for a long time," Miguel said, his fingers brushing the edges of the folder. "This estate has been like a second home to me, and you've been like family. But it's time for me to step down. I need to spend what years I have left with my grandchildren. My daughter's been asking me to move closer to them for years now, and I can't keep putting it off." Victor's face tightened. The words hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. Miguel, the man who had nurtured the gardens with a devotion that rivaled any artist's passion, was leaving. "I understand," Victor said after a pause, though his voice was distant. He wasn't used to people leaving, not on good terms anyway. "You've earned your retirement, Miguel. More than earned it." Miguel smiled softly, placing the folder on the desk. "I've prepared notes on the plants, the seasonal work schedules, and the tools. Whoever replaces me will have a guide to keep things running smoothly." Victor nodded but felt uneasy. Replacing Miguel wasn't going to be easy. Trusting someone new with the estate, a place he valued not just for its beauty but for the memories it held, felt like a gamble. The conversation ended cordially, but as Miguel left the study, Victor stared out the window at the gardens. Their beauty suddenly felt fragile, as if they could wither without Miguel's care. Victor wasted no time in preparing for Miguel's replacement. The idea of letting the gardens fall into disrepair was unthinkable. He summoned his personal assistant, Clara, a sharp and efficient woman who had worked for him for nearly a decade. "I want you to find a gardener," Victor instructed, his tone clipped. "Someone skilled, reliable, and discreet. The kind of person who doesn't pry into matters that don't concern them." Clara nodded, taking notes as Victor elaborated. "They must understand that this isn't just a job, it's a responsibility," Victor continued. "The gardens are a legacy. They're not just to be maintained. They're to be preserved, protected. I don't want someone with personal distractions or questionable connections. I've seen enough betrayal in my lifetime." Clara knew Victor's expectations were daunting, but she also knew better than to argue. She began her search that same day, reaching out to agencies, vetting resumes, and conducting preliminary interviews. The process dragged on longer than either of them expected. Several candidates seemed promising on paper but failed to meet Victor's exacting standards during the interview. Others balked at the level of commitment Victor demanded. "Gardening is an art," Victor muttered after yet another failed interview. "It requires focus, discipline. Not just some weekend hobbyist looking for a paycheck." Weeks turned into a month, and Victor's patience grew thin. The gardens, while still lush, were beginning to show signs of neglect. Without Miguel's steady hand, small details were slipping through the cracks. Then one morning, Clara approached Victor with a cautious smile. "I think I've found someone," she said. "His name is Carlos. He's young, doesn't have many references, but his skill is undeniable. He's quiet, polite, and willing to work under your conditions." Victor raised an eyebrow. "No references. That's a red flag." "He has no ties, no drama," Clara insisted. "Sometimes a clean slate is the best start." Victor hesitated, his instincts warring with his need to fill the position. After a moment he nodded. "Bring him in. Let's see what he's made of." Carlos arrived at the estate early on a crisp morning, his posture modest and his demeanor unassuming. He was a young man in his late 20s, with tanned skin, calloused hands, and a quiet air of determination. He wore a simple button-down shirt and carried a neatly organized bag of tools, a promising sign to Victor, who observed him from the study window. Clara introduced Carlos in the expansive kitchen, where Victor joined them, his sharp eyes appraising the newcomer. "Carlos," Victor began, his voice measured, "Clara speaks highly of your potential. I trust you understand the importance of this position." "Yes, sir," Carlos replied, his tone humble. "I've seen pictures of your gardens. They're remarkable. It would be an honor to maintain them." Victor scrutinized Carlos's words, looking for any hint of insincerity, but found none. Still, he wasn't ready to be impressed. "This estate demands more than maintenance," Victor said. "It requires care, attention to detail, and loyalty. If you're here for anything other than the work, we'll know soon enough." Carlos met Victor's gaze, his expression steady. "I'm here to work, Mr. Marquez." Satisfied for now, Victor gave Clara a slight nod. "Show him the grounds," he instructed. As Clara guided Carlos through the gardens, explaining the various plants and tasks, Victor returned to his study. He remained unconvinced. Trust for him was a luxury, not a given. Clara's endorsement meant something, but not enough to silence his suspicions. That night, Victor reviewed Carlos's sparse resume once more. The lack of references was troubling. Yet there was something about Carlos's demeanor, reserved, almost guarded, that Victor found oddly familiar. It reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. "I'll give him a chance," Victor murmured to himself, "but only under my terms." Despite Carlos's promising start, Victor couldn't shake his unease. His instincts, honed by decades of navigating cutthroat business deals, warned him to tread carefully. The lack of references, the reserved demeanor, and Carlos's uncanny calmness left too many questions unanswered. One evening, after a quiet dinner alone, Victor retreated to his study. The thought of leaving his wealth and property in the hands of someone he barely knew gnawed at him. He decided to test Carlos's character. In the corner of the study, a heavy antique safe stood, a relic from a time when Victor valued material possessions more than he did now. Inside were stacks of cash, valuable documents, and a few personal items. That night, Victor unlocked the safe and left it slightly ajar. He stepped back, scrutinizing the scene. To the untrained eye, it might look as though the safe hadn't been fully closed by accident. Victor's lips tightened. "Let's see if the new gardener's curiosity gets the better of him," he muttered. Victor didn't stop there. He called a trusted security technician to install a hidden camera in the study, ensuring it was positioned to capture anyone entering the room or approaching the safe. The camera was discreet, blending seamlessly with the ornate woodwork of the bookshelf. The test wasn't about the money. Victor wanted to know if Carlos could resist temptation, whether he could be trusted in a household where wealth was so accessible. To Victor, this was more than a job interview, it was a measure of character. By the time the camera was installed, the safe was prepped, and the room meticulously staged, Victor's doubts had solidified into resolve. He would watch and wait, letting Carlos reveal his true colors. As he sat in the dim light of the study, Victor's mind wandered to Miguel. The old gardener had never given him a reason to doubt his loyalty. But Miguel was from a different generation, a generation Victor trusted implicitly. Carlos was an enigma, and enigmas, Victor believed, were dangerous. Carlos's first days on the job were marked by quiet diligence. He arrived early, worked with a steady focus, and never once ventured beyond the garden unless instructed. Victor watched him from the window of his study, scrutinizing every movement. Carlos seemed to have a natural touch with plants. He revived a row of wilting roses that had been neglected during the transition and cleared an overgrown hedge with the precision of a sculptor. His work ethic was undeniable, but for Victor, the question of trust still loomed. In the evenings, Victor would review the footage captured by the hidden camera in the study. For 3 days, the recordings showed nothing but an undisturbed room. Carlos remained outside, tending to the garden as if the mansion itself held no interest for him. Victor found himself both relieved and perplexed. Was Carlos truly so focused on his work? Or was he merely biding his time? Then on the 4th day, Carlos requested access to the tool shed, which was connected to the house through a side entrance. Clara handed him the keys, and Victor felt his pulse quicken. The shed was close to the study, a fact Carlos would undoubtedly notice. That evening, Victor paid extra attention to the footage. Carlos entered the tool shed, retrieved a spade and pruning shears, and left without stepping foot in the study. Still, Victor's doubts persisted. A man with no past, no references, and no personal attachments was an anomaly. Was he truly here for the gardens, or was there a deeper, hidden motive? As the days turned into a week, Carlos continued his meticulous work. He repaired a broken fountain, planted a row of lavender bushes, and even suggested improvements to the irrigation system. His actions seemed to speak of genuine dedication. But Victor wasn't ready to let his guard down. The safe remained ajar, the camera running. He would wait for the moment Carlos's curiosity or greed led him astray. The hidden camera's footage became a nightly ritual for Victor. With a glass of scotch in hand, he would sit at his desk, studying the recordings for any sign of misstep. For the first week, the camera captured nothing unusual. Carlos entered and exited the garden with mechanical precision, maintaining a single-minded focus on his tasks. Victor found himself grudgingly impressed by Carlos's work ethic. The once neglected areas of the garden were blooming under his care. He worked long hours, often staying past sunset to ensure every detail was perfect. Yet, the unanswered questions about his past kept Victor wary. Then, on the 8th evening, the footage revealed something unexpected. Carlos entered the mansion, passing through the hallway that led to the study. He wasn't carrying any tools this time, and his movements were slow, almost hesitant. Victor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Was this the moment Carlos would prove his true intentions? The footage showed Carlos pausing near the study door. He glanced around, his expression unreadable, before moving closer. Victor's breath caught as Carlos stepped inside the room. For a moment, Carlos stood still, his eyes scanning the walls lined with bookshelves and the antique furnishings. He then moved toward the desk, his attention drawn to the partially open safe. Victor's heart raced. The camera captured every detail, Carlos leaning slightly forward, his gaze lingering on the stacks of cash inside. And then, nothing. Carlos straightened, his hands remaining at his sides. His gaze shifted from the safe to the items on the desk: papers, a pen set, and an old leather-bound notebook. He picked up the notebook, flipping through its pages as though searching for something. After a few moments, he closed it carefully and set it back in place. Carlos left the study without touching the safe or taking anything. Victor's mind whirled. Why had Carlos entered the study? What had he been looking for? And why had he resisted the temptation of the open safe? The next morning, Victor observed Carlos more closely than ever. The gardener went about his work as usual, pruning the hedges and inspecting the irrigation lines. There was no hint of unease or guilt in his demeanor. Victor couldn't shake the image of Carlos standing in his study, the notebook in hand. What had drawn him inside? And why hadn't he mentioned needing access to the house? The lack of an explanation gnawed at Victor, fueling his suspicion. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Carlos approached Clara in the kitchen. "Señora Clara," he began politely, "may I ask for the spare key to the tool shed? Some of the pruning tools inside need repair, and I'd like to take care of it tonight before tomorrow's work." Clara, unaware of Victor's growing paranoia, handed over the key without hesitation. "Course, Carlos. Just make sure to lock up when you're done." Carlos nodded, taking the key and heading toward the shed. Victor, watching from the study, felt his suspicion flare again. The tool shed was adjacent to the house, and the hallway to the study wasn't far. Victor reviewed the live feed from the hidden camera as Carlos moved around the shed, collecting tools and inspecting the workbench. Everything seemed ordinary until Carlos paused. He looked toward the doorway that led into the house and hesitated. Moments later, Carlos stepped into the hallway. His movements were deliberate, quiet. He stopped briefly near the study door, glancing at the safe and the desk as if weighing a decision. Then, to Victor's astonishment, he entered the study again. Victor leaned closer to the monitor, his heart pounding. Carlos walked directly to the desk, his focus fixed on the leather-bound notebook he'd examined the previous night. Why the notebook? What could possibly be so important inside it? Carlos opened the notebook and flipped through its pages again. His expression changed. His calm, neutral demeanor gave way to something deeper. Recognition, perhaps even longing. Victor watched, his suspicion giving way to confusion. What was Carlos searching for? Victor sat riveted, his eyes glued to the monitor as the hidden camera captured Carlos in the study. Carlos turned the pages of the notebook with care, as though the fragile paper held secrets he was determined to uncover. Victor's mind raced. That notebook was hardly valuable, just an old keepsake containing notes, sketches, and photographs from years past. What could Carlos possibly want with it? The footage revealed a moment of stillness as Carlos stopped flipping pages. His eyes fixated on something, a faded photograph tucked between two pages. Slowly, Carlos removed the photograph and held it up to the light. Victor strained to see, but the camera's angle didn't capture the image. He could only watch as Carlos's expression softened, his guarded demeanor giving way to something unguarded, a flicker of emotion, almost reverence. Carlos slipped the photograph into his pocket and gently closed the notebook, placing it back exactly where he found it. Without another glance at the open safe, he turned and left the study. Victor felt a surge of anger. The young gardener had taken something, not money but something personal. To Victor, the act was worse than theft. It was an intrusion, a violation of the privacy he held so dear. But then another thought struck him. Why the photograph? What connection could Carlos possibly have to the contents of that notebook? Victor rewound the footage, watching the sequence again and again, looking for clues. The camera had captured Carlos's movements with precision, but the answers eluded him. His fury simmered as the clock ticked toward midnight. Victor resolved to confront Carlos the following morning. He would demand answers: who Carlos truly was, why he had come to the estate, and what he intended to do with that photograph. Victor's instincts told him this was no ordinary case of temptation or greed. The truth, he feared, might be far more complicated, and far more personal. Morning arrived and Victor wasted no time. He summoned Carlos to the study, his tone curt and his expression unreadable. The young gardener entered cautiously, his posture respectful but wary. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Marquez?" Carlos asked, standing near the door. Victor gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Sit." Carlos complied, folding his hands in his lap. His calm demeanor remained intact, but Victor detected a flicker of tension in his eyes. "Let's not waste time," Victor began, his voice icy. "Last night you entered this room without permission. You took something from my desk." Carlos stiffened but didn't speak. Victor leaned forward. "I have a camera in this room. I saw you remove a photograph from my notebook. I want to know why." Carlos's jaw tightened. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then he reached into his pocket and produced the photograph, placing it on the desk. Victor snatched it up, his breath catching as he looked at the image. It was an old, sepia-toned photograph of a woman in her 20s. She stood in the gardens of the estate, smiling brightly, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. It was Isabella. Victor's heart clenched. Isabella had been his housekeeper decades ago, a kind, spirited woman who had worked tirelessly to support her young son. She had left the estate abruptly, and though Victor had tried to contact her, she had vanished without a trace. "What does this woman mean to you?" Victor demanded, his voice unsteady. Carlos looked up, his expression resolute. "She's my mother." The room fell silent. Victor stared at Carlos, the resemblance suddenly clear. The same dark eyes, the same determined set of the jaw. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, leaving him momentarily speechless. Victor gripped the edge of his desk, struggling to steady himself. The words echoed in his mind. "She's my mother." Memories of Isabella flooded back. Her warm smile, her unflinching dedication, and the day she left without explanation. "You're her son," Victor said, his voice low, almost disbelieving. "Yes," Carlos replied, his tone steady but tinged with emotion. "I took this job to learn more about her, about the time she spent here. She always spoke fondly of this place, but she never told me why she left or what happened." Victor's confusion quickly gave way to anger. "And you thought sneaking into my study and stealing from me was the way to do it?" Carlos bristled. "I wasn't stealing. I only wanted to know the truth. That photograph, it's the first tangible connection I've had to my mother's past in years. I didn't mean any disrespect." Victor's temper flared. "Disrespect? You violated my trust. Do you have any idea what this estate means to me? What she meant to me?" The mention of Isabella seemed to shift something in Carlos. His defensiveness softened, replaced by curiosity. "Then tell me," he said quietly. "What did she mean to you? Why would she never speak about why she left this place?" Victor hesitated, the weight of decades-old regret pressing down on him. The truth was complicated, tangled in emotions he hadn't confronted in years. Isabella hadn't just been his housekeeper. She had been someone he cared for deeply. Her sudden departure had left a void he never filled. But could he share that with her son? A young man who had already seen him as the enemy. Carlos's gaze remained steady. "I didn't come here to cause trouble, Mr. Marquez. I came here because I needed answers. If you can't give them to me, I'll leave. But I think you owe it to my mother, and to yourself, to tell me the truth." Victor stared at Carlos, his anger cooling, replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. For the first time in years, he found himself at a crossroads. Victor sat back in his chair, the weight of Carlos's words pressing against his chest. He studied the young man across from him, seeing echoes of Isabella in his determined gaze. The anger that had burned so brightly a moment ago began to ebb, replaced by something more complex, a mix of regret, sorrow, and an ache he hadn't felt in years. "You're right," Victor said at last, his voice heavy. "I do owe it to you. And to her." Carlos leaned forward slightly, his expression a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "Your mother was more than just a housekeeper," Victor began, his eyes fixed on the photograph. He was special. She came to work for me after my wife passed. First, it was just professional. She was diligent, kind, and brought life to this house when I thought it was lost forever. He paused, his voice softening. Over time we grew close. She became a confidant, someone I could trust implicitly in a way I couldn't with anyone else. But it wasn't just about me. She often spoke of you, her little boy, the light of her life. She was so proud of you, Carlos. Carlos's expression shifted, a flicker of surprise and emotion crossing his face. But one day, Victor continued, his voice breaking slightly, she left. No warning, no goodbye. Just a note saying she couldn't stay. I tried to find her, but she'd disappeared. I didn't know why, and I've carried that question with me ever since. Carlos frowned, his brow furrowing as he absorbed the story. She never told me any of this. She always said she left her job to protect me, but she wouldn't say from what. Victor's heart sank. Protect you? From what? Carlos shook his head. I don't know. She passed away when I was 16. Every time I asked about her past, she'd change the subject. I thought maybe you knew something. Victor stared at the photograph, his mind swirling. What had Isabella been protecting her son from? Had she left to shield him from something in Victor's life, or something else entirely? I don't have all the answers, Victor admitted, his voice raw. But I promise you this. We'll find them together. For the first time since entering the estate, Carlos's guarded demeanor cracked. He nodded, his expression a mix of relief and gratitude. Carlos took a deep breath, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. For a moment, he looked hesitant, as though deciding how much of himself to reveal. Then he began to speak. My mother was the strongest person I've ever known, he said. She raised me on her own, working long hours to make sure I had everything I needed. She used to talk about this estate. Not often, but when she did, her face would light up. She said it was the most beautiful place she'd ever worked. But there was always this sadness when she mentioned it. Victor listened intently, leaning forward slightly. She never talked about you directly, Carlos continued, but I could tell you were important to her. She used to say, the man who owns that house. He has a good heart, even if he doesn't always show it. Victor felt a pang in his chest. The idea that Isabella had spoken kindly of him, even after leaving so abruptly, brought an unexpected wave of emotion. She worked other jobs after she left here, Carlos went on. None of them lasted long. She always seemed restless, like she was running from something. Then, when I was 12, we moved far away, different town, different people. She told me it was for a fresh start. Carlos paused, his jaw tightening. I didn't understand it then, but now I think she was trying to keep us safe. From what, I don't know. But I think it's connected to her time here. Victor's brows furrowed. Safe. From what, Carlos? I can't think of anything here that would have put her, or you, in danger. Carlos shook his head, frustration evident in his expression. I don't know. All I have are pieces of a puzzle, and until now, none of them made sense. That photograph. It's the first real clue I've had in years. Victor felt a surge of determination. Then we'll put those pieces together, he said firmly. If there's a truth to uncover, we'll find it. Carlos met Victor's gaze, a flicker of hope shining through. Victor rose from his chair and walked to the window, his gaze settling on the garden that Isabella had once tended with so much care. The memories of her were as vivid as the flowers she had cultivated. Bright, vibrant, and impossible to ignore. She came here during one of the darkest periods of my life, Victor began, his voice quiet. I had just lost my wife, and I was consumed by work, using it as an excuse to avoid my grief. Isabella wasn't just another employee. She became a lifeline. Carlos listened in silence, sensing the depth of emotion in Victor's words. She had this way about her, Victor continued, turning back to face Carlos. She could make you feel like everything was going to be okay, even when it wasn't. She was kind, but she was also strong, stronger than I ever gave her credit for. Victor sat down, his shoulders heavy with the weight of his recollections. We grew close. Closer than I think either of us expected. She became more than a housekeeper. She became my friend. Maybe even more than that, though neither of us ever said it out loud. Carlos's eyes widened slightly, but he said nothing, waiting for Victor to continue. And then one day she was gone, Victor said, his voice tightening. No explanation, no warning. Just a note saying she had to leave and that it was for the best. I tried to find her. I had the resources after all, but she'd disappeared completely. I thought about her every day for years, wondering what I'd done wrong or what had driven her away. Victor leaned back, his eyes clouded with regret. Now you're here, telling me she was trying to protect you. It's like the past is reaching out, demanding answers I never had. Carlos nodded, his expression thoughtful. Whatever she was running from, it must have been serious. But she never spoke badly of you, Mr. Marquez. In fact, she always said you were one of the few people who truly cared about her. Victor closed his eyes briefly, the words both comforting and painful. If only I'd known how much she was carrying. Maybe I could have helped her. Victor sat in silence for a moment, his gaze fixed on the photograph of Isabella. The air between him and Carlos was heavy with unspoken emotions and unanswered questions. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but tinged with resolve. I can't change the past, Victor said, placing the photograph carefully on the desk. But I can make things right now. I owe that to Isabella. And to you. Carlos looked up, surprised by the shift in Victor's tone. I misjudged you, Victor admitted. When you came here I thought you were just another opportunist. Someone looking to take advantage of what I've built. But I see now that you're here for something far more important than a job. Carlos nodded, his guarded demeanor softening. I'm here to understand her choices, her sacrifices. And to understand how this place fit into her life. Victor stood and walked to a bookshelf, his fingers brushing over the spines until he found what he was looking for. A thick ledger filled with notes and records from years past. He opened it and flipped through the pages, his expression thoughtful. This estate holds a lot of history, he said. And not all of it is mine. If your mother's story is here, we'll find it. He placed the ledger on the desk in front of Carlos. From now on, you're not just the gardener. You're part of this estate, part of its legacy. I want you to help me uncover the truth. Not just about Isabella, but about everything she left behind. Carlos blinked, taken aback by the gesture. You don't have to do this, Mr. Marquez. Victor's expression softened. Oh me, Victor. And yes, I do have to do this. For years I've buried myself in work, convinced that my wealth and success were the only things that mattered. But now I see that the people who've touched our lives, that's what truly matters. He extended his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Carlos shook it. Let's do this together, Victor said. For the first time since arriving at the estate, Carlos smiled. A small, tentative smile, but one filled with hope. The days that followed were unlike any Carlos or Victor had imagined. The two men began working together, combing through old records, photographs, and letters stored in the mansion. Each discovery brought a new piece of Isabella's story to light. They found receipts from the time she worked on the estate, notes she had left for the staff, and even a journal Victor hadn't known existed. In her neat handwriting, Isabella had chronicled her days, her hopes for Carlos, and her struggles to navigate a world that often felt unkind. One evening, as they sifted through a box of papers in the study, Carlos came across a small envelope addressed to Victor. He handed it over, his hands trembling slightly. Victor opened the envelope carefully, revealing a letter dated shortly before Isabella left the estate. As he read it, his breath caught. The letter explained everything. Isabella had discovered that a former associate of Victor's, someone with a criminal past, had been asking questions about her and her son. Fearing for Carlos's safety, she had decided to leave without revealing her reasons. She didn't want Victor to shoulder the blame or the burden of her decision. I couldn't let them find him, the letter read. Carlos is my world, and I won't let anyone harm him. Please understand, Victor. This isn't your fault. I'll always remember our time here with gratitude and affection. Victor's hands shook as he folded the letter. She left to protect you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Carlos looked at the letter, his eyes glistening. She sacrificed so much for me. I never really understood how much until now. Victor reached out, placing a hand on Carlos's shoulder. She was an extraordinary woman, and I failed her by not protecting her the way she protected you. But I won't fail you. For the first time, Carlos saw Victor not as a wealthy, guarded man, but as someone deeply human, carrying his own wounds and regrets. Victor's words marked the beginning of a new chapter, not just for the estate, but for the connection between him and Carlos. Their shared mission to honor Isabella's memory breathed life into the once stoic mansion. Victor, who had spent years locked in rigid routines, began involving Carlos in more than just the garden. He invited him to dinners in the formal dining room, shared stories about the estate's history, and even began teaching him the intricacies of estate management. You're not just a gardener anymore, Victor told Carlos one evening over a simple meal. This place is as much yours as it is mine. You're family now. Carlos was initially hesitant to accept such generosity. His entire life had been shaped by self-reliance, and the idea of belonging somewhere felt foreign. But Victor's sincerity was undeniable, and over time, Carlos allowed himself to trust the older man. In turn, Carlos brought a fresh perspective to the estate. He suggested modernizing parts of the irrigation system, planting new types of flora to attract pollinators, and creating spaces in the garden that were both functional and beautiful. Victor, who had once insisted on tradition above all, found himself embracing these changes with enthusiasm. The transformation wasn't just physical. Victor seemed lighter, more open, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He began to laugh more often, to share moments of vulnerability that he had once kept buried. Carlos, too, began to change. The guarded young man who had arrived with so many questions and so much suspicion was now confident, hopeful, and at peace with his past. One day, as they walked together through the blooming gardens, Carlos paused to look at Victor. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. Victor raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For giving me a place to belong," Carlos said. Victor smiled, clapping him on the back. "You've given me the same thing, son." Months passed, and the estate flourished in ways it hadn't for years. The gardens bloomed with a vibrancy that reflected the new energy within its walls. Victor, once a man consumed by solitude and mistrust, found himself waking each day with a renewed sense of purpose. One crisp morning, as Victor stood on the balcony overlooking the gardens, he reflected on the journey that had brought him and Carlos to this point. The past, once a source of pain and regret, now felt like a foundation for something meaningful. Carlos joined him, wiping his hands on a cloth after tending to a row of newly planted orchids. "The roses are coming in nicely," he said, gesturing to the vibrant bushes below. Victor nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Your mother would have loved what you've done with the place. She had a way of seeing beauty in everything, and you've brought that back here." Carlos smiled, his expression tinged with emotion. "I think she'd be happy knowing we're taking care of it together." Victor turned to Carlos, a rare softness in his eyes. "You've taught me something, you know. For years, I thought success was about building walls, protecting myself from betrayal, from loss. But it's not. It's about connection. About letting people in, even when it's hard." Carlos nodded. "I think my mother believed that too. That's why she left. To protect me, but also to protect what mattered to her." Victor placed a hand on Carlos's shoulder. "She would have been proud of you. And I'm proud of you too." As the sun rose higher in the sky, bathing the estate in golden light, Victor felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in decades. The mansion, the gardens, and even the safe in his study, all the symbols of his life's work, meant little compared to the bond he had rediscovered. For the first time, Victor saw a future not defined by wealth or power, but by legacy, family, and the shared love of a place that had brought two lives together. As time went on, the estate became more than just a home for Victor and Carlos. It became a living testament to the power of love, sacrifice, and reconciliation. The once lonely mansion, with its sprawling gardens, now hummed with life and purpose. Victor often reflected on how one decision, hiring Carlos, had changed everything. It had led him to confront a past he had buried, to honor a woman who had given him so much, and to forge a bond with the son she had loved fiercely. The story of the estate wasn't just about wealth or grandeur anymore. It was about healing old wounds, embracing vulnerability, and finding meaning in the connections that define us. This story is a reminder that life's greatest treasures are not found in safes or vaults, but in the relationships we nurture. Victor's journey teaches us that trust and reconciliation can lead to redemption, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Carlos's determination to uncover the truth about his mother speaks to the power of persistence and the human need for closure. Together, they remind us that facing the past can open the door to a brighter, more meaningful future. If there's a lesson to be drawn, it's this. Sometimes letting people in is the bravest thing you can do, and it's often the most rewarding. What about you? Have you ever faced a moment where opening up to someone changed your life? Or uncovered a story from the past that brought clarity to your present? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments below, or pass this story along to someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to reconcile, to forgive, or to forge new connections. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and let us know what it meant to you. Together, we can keep these messages of hope and humanity alive.